Good evening. The news gang is here. Another proposed law on good manners. How about that? We hear what Sonko and two legislators have got to do with it. The big four are all on course. Are you feeling it? Maraga's ruling on when to attend Jamhuri Day, how the entire bench made a unanimous judgment with their feet. Also on the show tonight, Nairobi on autopilot, or is it just party after party? We'll also have the kicker, the punchline, and the angle. Yvonne is still away on leave, and Jamila is bereaved tonight. Our thoughts and prayers are with her. We begin with a soundbite right now from none other than the president himself, speaking about conflict of interest. A very interesting one we heard from Nyayo Stadium, and we'll be talking about it a lot tonight.
Is it fair? Is it right for legislators who have control over funds and exercise oversight over the judiciary to appear in courts as counsel? Is it fair on the judicial officer hearing the case or other parties that one party in the case is represented by persons who can literally change the law applicable to the dispute, control the career progression of the judge or magistrate, or are able to speak with the voice of an entire arm of government? Is it fair? Is it right for legislators who have control over funds and exercise oversight over the judiciary to appear in courts as counsel? Is it fair on the judicial officer hearing the case or other parties that one party in the case is represented by persons who can literally change the law applicable to the dispute, control the career progression of the judge or magistrate, or are able to speak with the voice of an entire arm of government?
Gentlemen, well, that actually had to play twice because I think it's so interesting. But look, I mean, the president saying some really weighty things there. Francis, you were at that ceremony. How did that go down? I mean, where is the president coming from?
You would have expected very little of that from Nyayo Stadium. Normally, in such a conventional function, very few people would have expected to hear President Uhuru Kenyatta dwell on that matter of conflict of interest. And especially so soon after what seemed like a clear case of conflict of interest at the anti-corruption court, when two senators and one member of the National Assembly constituted the legal team representing Nairobi Governor Mike Sonko in that 387 million shillings corruption case before Justice Douglas Ogoti. However, you could see the reaction from the main team there. I saw Senator Kipchumba Murkomen was right in front, sitting on the front dais at the Nyayo National Stadium. Probably totally unexpected for the president to wade in that direction. And in my opinion, the president has opened a very serious discussion on one, what constitutes conflict of interest, and how far does that conflict of interest go, and how will he and the government tame that conflict of interest, and is he part of that conflict of interest? Very serious questions will be emerging as a result of that soundbite from Nyayo National Stadium.
But Linus, for the president to have put this, or at least had it put in his speech, that suggests that it wasn't one of those things, you know, you think about when you're about to speak and say, oh, maybe I should speak about this. This is something he clearly intended to speak about, which is why he went ahead to talk about the conflict of interest legislation, the proposed legislation that he says is going to be in motion shortly. It seems that this is something that the president has been worrying about, but one might say, well, our national values in the Constitution, the Chapter 6 that we keep talking about, everything that is regarded as conflict of interest seems to have been captured in the spirit of the 2010 Constitution, isn't it?
You see, Joe, first, speeches are remembered by their key words. I think Martin Luther King, very many years ago, would be remembered for his "I have a dream" line. Those were the three key words. And today, we saw the president many times saying, is it fair?
Is it right?
Is it fair? Is it right? And those are the questions that he's raising. And I want to say that the concern about conflict of interest by President Uhuru Kenyatta is older than the appearance of Mike Sonko in court and the defense by Murkomen and Senator Mutula Kilonzo. You can look back to the recent BBI report, and one of the recommendations that it made was, let's undo the recommendations of the Ndegwa Commission that in 1971 recommended that civil servants can participate in things like businesses, private businesses, as long as they exercised ethical standards and also professionalism. Clearly, it is a position that has been untenable, I think, right from 1971, even before the ink of the report by the Ndegwa Commission dried. So there have been efforts and there have been a discussion as to whether civil servants should be in business. And even on the question of Harambes, whether they should be participating in fundraisers, because the argument that has been made is this has been feeding corruption. So the BBI report did recommend that the Ndegwa Commission recommendations of 1971 should be undone. And that informs the line by President Uhuru Kenyatta, is it fair? I think Murkomen and Mutula Kilonzo and basically senators representing a governor that they should oversee basically fueled or caused an increased desire to fast-track this process of undoing the recommendations of the Ndegwa report.
But it is quite interesting. I mean, some people would say, how could they not see this? This is a question of basically what is right, what is wrong. Because if you talk about like what we saw in court, I mean, without going through the legal argument around it, but one would just say, I mean, it is very simple. These are the same guys who sit in the Senate, which oversight the counties, and there is a real possibility, for example, of that very Mike Sonko appearing before the Senate. And so one would ask, okay, what are the two legislators going to say? Are they going to be on the side where people are asking probing questions of Sonko, or are they going to be on the other side and say, we know this guy from the courts? And even if they took the opposite side, it will look so disingenuous. Like, what are these people doing? I mean, they were just the other day, they were in court defending this gentleman. So some of those things that are called conflict of interest, those are big words. But the truth is, there are just some things that are just wrong or right, and you just see them without any trouble. And it is actually perplexing, Francis, that this is actually now going to be subject of another legislative process, yet our Constitution, the very spirit of our Constitution 2010, seems to be about people just making these ethical decisions that then help them to be effective at what they do. Absolutely, Joe. And the question is, then what constitutes conflict of interest? Because in 2017, during that presidential petition, Senator Murkomen was part of the legal team that represented President Uhuru Kenyatta against Raila Odinga in that petition. Was there a conflict of interest then? Professor Kithure Kindiki was also part of that legal team in 2013 and in 2017. Did it constitute conflict of interest at that time? When James Orengo, Senator for Siaya and Senior Counsel, represented Sospita Ojamong, the governor for Busia, in a corruption case, was that conflict of interest? Was there also conflict of interest when members of parliament represented Deputy Chief Justice Philomena Mwilu when there were allegations of corruption, abuse of office, failure to pay taxes against her, and they successfully managed to shield her against that prosecution? Was there conflict of interest at that point? So what are the boundaries? What are the parameters of conflict of interest? Therein lies the question. And as Joe, you rightly said, look, there's also a possibility that an impeachment motion may come up against the Nairobi governor. What will the senators, the two senators, do when that motion comes before the House? Because already, if you're representing somebody in court, you already have an advantage in terms of knowledge of a few things.
that a lawyer and a client share, you know, in terms of information. So how will they treat that?
There could be incriminating sort of information that you have.
How will they treat that impeachment motion should it come to the House? Senator Johnson Sakaja of Nairobi County raised a very fundamental question. One, what is the principal function of the Senate? It is to protect county governments. What does protecting county governments mean? One, it is about prudent management of the resources that have been devolved to the counties. And so when there are questions about the usage of those very resources, and you're representing in court a person who is accused of mishandling, mismanaging, siphoning those public resources, therein, in my opinion, lies a fundamental question of conflict of interest.
You see, Joe, I see it, whether you see it from the angle of Sonko's case or from the speech, from the is it fair speech, I think the aggregate lesson from, for politicians is selective application of the Constitution and the law doesn't work. Somehow it catches up with you. Because President Uhuru Kenyatta will find himself in a very difficult spot. He has just opened the Pandora's box with this conflict of interest question. And you can see online already the conversations are not pleasant. There are a lot of questions, especially on whether State House itself, President Uhuru Kenyatta himself, has lived by the spirit of that conflict of interest clause that he's now pushing for. Because the laws of equity really require that if you're seeking equity, you must seek equity with clean hands. If you're seeking equity, then you must do equity. And President Uhuru Kenyatta, going forward, will be put on the spot by politicians no less, because conflict of interest directly attacks the political class that has done things this way since 1963.
But to be fair, Linus, the president will say that, well, he mentioned in his speech that 2019 would be some kind of a starting over for the country, that we were turning sort of a new leaf. In fact, there are words that he used that were quite interesting, like bringing the river back to its course, which is symbolically a very, very powerful sort of statement, that there was a way that we were going before. One would ask at what point, but that we lost the way somewhere in our journey, and that now we are getting back to where the river used to be. And that is an interesting analogy that the president put. But I think that what is going to be, in my view, critical to watch is the fact that even this legislation on conflict of interest will still have to go to Parliament to meet these very people who are involved in the alleged conflict of interest. And I think where the rubber meets the road is that point at which now the legislators themselves have to decide whether they are going to make this law or not, considering that there will be a question of conflict of interest, making laws that might disadvantage them going forward. But Francis, why don't we look a little bit into this proposed legislation? What are some of the key highlights that stand out for you as things that will make for interesting discussion going forward? Because I see they have things about people not, public servants not engaged, and actually, it clarifies the definition a little bit, making it clear that whether these people are appointed or elected, this conflict of interest issues will still apply to them. Absolutely.
Look, every so often when you engage members of parliament on a Thursday, they tell you they have about 200 invitations to Harambes. That is a very fertile ground for conflict of interest. Because imagine a situation where a member of parliament has been invited to about 200 Harambes, and they have to contribute about 10,000 shillings for each of the Harambes. That's about 2 million shillings. And their salary is less than 1 million shillings per month. Where do they get that difference? Therein lies a fundamental question of conflict of interest. It is a no-brainer that quite a number of our MPs have a direct interest in the resources that are allocated to their respective constituencies in form of CDF. They may not directly be the ones in charge of the projects that are financed via CDF, but they have a stake in terms of who gets that tender or that contract, and there's always a kickback. I mean, truth be told, Look at the allegations that have been made about rent-seeking by members of parliament. You remember the hula baloo and the drama around the sugar report? Those are some of the areas that...
And by their very own admission, some money was being given in the toilets.
Absolutely. And you've also had several allegations of some of the committees being used as extortion rackets. And you remember there were serious allegations that were made against the Senate Public Accounts Committee. Those allegations are still unresolved to date. So this conflict of interest debate is interesting, but I'll be more interested in seeing how members of parliament will interact with the conflict of interest bill that will be coming to the House next year, because the two houses have gone on recess. I heard the president say that he's directing the Attorney General to fast track the submission of that bill to the cabinet for approval and subsequent transmission to the National Assembly. It will be very interesting to see how our members of parliament are going to interact with that bill, because it may be like sharpening a knife or a panga, if you may like, to slice them.
But how many of them are involved in this so-called gainful employment, and they are also still members of parliament? What would you say?
Yes, Linus.
Is it a majority, Linus, or do you think it's just a few people who are lawyers who go to court to represent people, and it's high profile, we see it on TV and so we notice it? But there could be quite a number of MPs there doing all kinds of things.
Pick any list of a corruption case, and therein lies the answer. It's not really about business, private business, but it's doing business with government. Because a lot of the politicians, why this issue is becoming such a serious and grave matter right now is because if you look at the trends in corruption cases, you see a lot of politicians doing business with government. A politician's wife would be the main contractor in road construction of roads. The daughter will be supplying stuff to the government. We saw a case where, a governor is supplying fuel to his government, to his own government. It's ridiculous. I think these are the things that this kind of bill is trying to target. But there's something here that must be pointed out, and that is the spirit of Harambee that is unfortunately going to suffer the consequences because of the war on corruption, because Harambees, it seems, have now been tied with corruption, which I think is essentially false. If you look at the history of Harambees, this was a good and typically Kenyan spirit of giving, founded in the years of President Jomo Kenyatta, who said that we pull together Harambee. It is our national motto, putting resources together. Some of us who come from the villages know how many students Harambees produced, sending them overseas for education, how many medical bills Harambees have paid. And it's about everybody giving, including politicians, including civil servants.
There were even schools were called Harambee schools, actually.
Even schools were built with Harambees. I think there needs to be some logic into this whole exercise. Just fight crime, fight corruption, without running in the sidelines of it and pretending to target it when you're not actually going for it.
But I think, Linus, where the confusion has come about, like what Francis was talking about, where it is almost expected, there is an expectation from the electorate that if you're a member of parliament, you have to attend every single Harambee that is around here. If you don't, then they'll say, oh, huyu tulimchagua mepotelea huko Nairobi.
You're a miser.
Yeah, you're a miser, you don't spend, hatokangi kitu huyu jamaa. So there's a problem that these MPs are also dealing with.
That culture did not start from the people.
A practical
that culture did not start from the voters. It was brought in by politicians. They brought the culture of handouts. It's not people who asked for handouts first.
But it is people who receive the handouts, Linus.
They receive the handouts, and because they have problems. Some of the people who take handouts are actually very, very poor people. Some of them rely on that entirely. They line up in offices, they line up waiting for the member of parliament. Some of them, and you talk to members of parliament, and I know, Francis, you do this, they'll tell you lists of genuine problems that they have to resolve in the villages. You'll get a call from somebody who actually has someone admitted in hospital, a bill gone through the roof, and they're trying to get this from the member of parliament. These are real needs. There are real problems there. What needs to change is the culture that politicians are creating. CDF brought a structure that you can legitimately address some of these concerns. You don't have to give a handout to a school. Address it through CDF. Handouts should not be bursaries. CDF can address that. And you see a lot of arguments, and I remember when the Pesa Mashinani debate came about, it was about sending more of these national resources to the grassroots. But members of parliament, elected leaders are still using even the money they get, whether it's a CDF account or government funds, they use it as handouts.
Joe, I mean, I also listened to the president say no one is forced to work in government. He was saying in Kiswahili, hakuna mtu analazimishwa kufanya kazi kwa serikali. Just listen to what he was saying.
State and public officers are not above the law. Our constitutional order is a jealous one. It demands that state and public officers serve no other master but it. A teacher in the public service cannot have one foot in the classroom and the other in parliament. One cannot serve as a legislator at the national or county level while at the same time practicing law, whether or not for gain. Mtu halazimishwi kufanya hii kazi, lakini ukiamua kuifanya, lazima uifanye kwa njia ya haki.
Very interesting. Lazima ufanye kazi kwa haki, hakuna mtu analazimishwa kufanya kazi kwa serikali. You see, the BBI report, there's also a clause that is saying, if you are going to work for government or in the government, you must stay away from business. If you want to do business, then stay away from government offices. Now, this is where a serious issue lies. But there's also a question of some of these pronouncements, Linas and Joe. How will this be implemented? You remember that soundbite at Kinoru Stadium in Meru about lifestyle audit?
Yes,
and repeated in Mombasa.
And lie detectors.
Yeah, and repeated in Mombasa by the president that itaanza na mimi, alafu huyu, alafu governor. You remember?
Yes.
We are still waiting for that. Ianze na mimi,
but I think,
huyu, alafu governor.
But Linus, there's also another question that arises. If you say, for example, you know, talk about a teacher in the village, and as things stand now, many of those teachers are involved in some kiosk business. They're doing all manner of things, and in their words, to make ends meet, because they're saying we are not paid that well. Teachers have been pushing for a better pay and that sort of thing. So there's going to be a pushback, I think, also from unions and all these people who are going to say, how are you going to force us to not have anything else? They'll be saying, well, we do this after school and whatever. No one can prove that, obviously. But then they'll be saying, no, there are all these other things we do when we are not in school and all of that that help us to make ends meet. Are you going to pay us better so that we can fully focus? Same thing with doctors, for example, who serve in public hospitals. They'll be having their own private clinics as a way of basically just supplementing whatever salaries they may have.
Joe, this discussion about conflict of interest was part of what the Kenya Medical and Dentist Board was talking about not so long ago, saying that it was seizing licensing of private doctors to operate clinics, those who are operating in public hospitals. I mean, every so often you've had discussion about some doctors who, let's say, are employed in a public hospital, but they spend very little of their time there compared to the amount of time that they spend in their private clinics. Then there will be a serious pushback, as you say, because somebody will argue that what I am receiving from public employment is not enough. So I have to find ways of making ends meet. I have to find ways of supplementing that income. But how much is enough? Maybe that is a fundamental question that will emerge.
Joe, this discussion on conflict of interest runs the risk of actually being perceived as a distraction to the war on corruption, because it's a diversion. I think prosecution of corruption can actually help end conflict of interest. just separate office holders from the public funds that they run. Because right now, what is happening, and if you look at the first term of the Jubilee administration, things came to this now, the realization that it's not sustainable. Because basically everybody who had access to government funds, nearly everybody, because I must say there are a lot of good people out there, but a lot of them took advantage of access to public government funds. And Francis, you pointed out on the issue of lifestyle audits. The president spoke tough about that and actually promised that it should be done. None of that has been witnessed. And there's something else that the president needs to watch. He needs to actually have his eyes on the clock, because he's a second-term president, and there isn't a lot of time for tough talk. Somewhere down the line of this second term, people will stop listening to that tough talk because people move to the next stage. Ask President President Mwai Kibaki how the last year was, or even Daniel Toroitich arap Moi how 2002 was. Once the succession politics come in, all this talk without action cannot have any effect.
Okay, we need to take a break, gentlemen. We'll come back and talk a little bit more about the president's speech, including what he had to say about the Big Four agenda. And by the way, the judiciary, they were not there. What happened? Newsgang is back in just a short while.